On the 5th of January, 1942, Tokyo's streets rang with jubilant cries of triumph. Ordinary citizens celebrated the remarkable victories achieved during the opening weeks of the Pacific War. Yet, behind closed doors, a very different atmosphere prevailed in the offices of Japan's highest naval commanders. That day, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Combined Fleet, summoned his staff to begin preparation for the second stage of operations. Reports flowing in from the Philippines, Malaya, and other fronts convinced him that within only a few months, Japan's armies would control not only East Asia, but also much of the Pacific territories seized since December 1941. Convinced of a need for careful foresight, Yamamoto instructed his chief of staff, Admiral Mato Megaki, to have new operational plans ready no later than mid-February. The astonishing speed with which Japanese forces had conquered the Western Pacific stunned even their own planners. But the euphoria in Tokyo was far from unanimous. Within the Imperial General Staff, fierce debates raged. Some officers, swept up by nationalist fervor, urged Japan to advance as long as its armies remained victorious, regardless of distance or cost. Their dream was an empire stretching endlessly across oceans and continents. Yamamoto, however, belonged to a very different camp. From the outset, he had voiced deep reservations about waging war against the United States and Britain. He feared the long-term consequences and doubted Japan's ability to sustain a prolonged conflict against powers with vastly greater industrial capacity. His misgivings were so widely known that friends within the general staff warned him that remaining in Tokyo might place his life in danger. Assassination by ultranationalists was a real possibility, so Yamamoto often stayed aboard the flagship Yamato, far from political intrigues in the capital. Even so, Yamamoto's views were no secret. His trusted chief of staff, Admiral Agaki, noted in his diary Yamamoto's repeated insistence that Japan's victories could not last unless guided by far-sighted statesmanship. While others spoke of glory and conquest, Yamamoto often used words of caution, stressing that triumph in the first month was no guarantee of eventual success. Yamamoto's conversations before Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's concerns stretched back months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. In the autumn of 1941, roughly 3 months before the war began, he met with an old acquaintance, Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the ultranationalist Kokusuki organization. Their meeting took place at the prestigious Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. During this conversation, Yamamoto warned Sasakawa that war had already become unavoidable due to reckless political decisions. At first, he admitted Japan might appear unstoppable, sweeping across territories like an octopus extending its tentacles. But he cautioned that the metaphorical octopus could just as easily be stretched thin and flattened under the weight of overextension. Yamamoto emphasized that the right moment for diplomacy would come with the fall of Singapore. Such a disaster, he argued, would shake British confidence in India and might open the door for peace negotiations. His experience gave weight to these views. He had represented Japan at the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934, and he had served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. From these years abroad, he knew the West well, both its strengths and its determination. Thus, Yamamoto concluded, while Japan had no choice but to fight once war was declared, the nation must seek a peace settlement within a year and a half at most. Beyond that, he believed Japan's power would inevitably falter. He asked Sasakawa to spread this message among right-wing political leaders, hoping that his warning might reach the ears of those who shaped national policy. Triumphs and illusions. By early January 1942, Japan's victories seemed unbroken. The U.S. battleship fleet had been crippled at Pearl Harbor. The British warships HMS Repulse and HMS Prince of Wales had been sunk off the coast of Malaya. In the Philippines, Manila and the American naval base at Cavite had fallen. Hong Kong had surrendered. Japanese troops were landing across the Dutch East Indies, New Ireland, and the Solomon Islands. Yet, amidst this string of triumphs, Yamamoto remained uneasy. The Pearl Harbor attack, while dramatic, had failed to destroy the most critical elements of the U.S. fleet, the aircraft carriers, which had been at sea during the strike. These carriers now represented a looming and unpredictable threat. For Yamamoto, this meant that Japan still required a spectacular achievement, something that would not only cripple American power, but also provide Tokyo with leverage to propose peace from a position of strength. Singapore, expected to fall in 5 or 6 months, seemed at first to promise such an opportunity. When it finally capitulated on February 15, 1942, Yamamoto welcomed the news, but quickly realized that even this stunning victory would not force America to the negotiating table. Japan needed something more decisive, something that would shake Washington's resolve. In early 1942, Yamamoto convened discussions on where Japan should strike next. His first suggestion was an attack against the Soviet Union. Such a campaign, he argued, could exploit Moscow's vulnerability as it fought desperately against Hitler's armies on the Western Front. But the Japanese army flatly refused. Their forces were already bogged down in China and Southeast Asia. To open another front across the vast Siberian landmass was unthinkable. This rejection left Yamamoto and the naval planners to consider other possibilities. The debates that followed revealed the growing divisions within Japan's leadership. The Indian Ocean vision. Yamamoto's favorite option was bold and global in scope. Strike into the Indian Ocean, destroy the British Eastern Fleet, and isolate the Allies from their colonial holdings. He envisioned invading Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, luring the British fleet into battle, and annihilating it just as he had struck the Americans at Pearl Harbor. Such a victory would open the way for Japan to push into the Middle East, link up with German forces advancing toward the Caucasus, and secure oil supplies vital to sustaining Japan's navy. In Yamamoto's eyes, this would not only cripple Britain's influence in Asia, but also create a bridge to cooperation with Germany. The army, however, dismissed the plan as unrealistic. Its resources were tied down, and cooperation with German campaigns in Europe seemed too uncertain. The Australian plan. Another proposal came from the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, who championed an invasion of Australia. Their logic was straightforward. If Japan seized Australia, it would deprive the Americans of a vital forward base from which to mount counterattacks. The plan called for moving through the Solomon Islands, capturing New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and eventually isolating or occupying Australia and New Zealand. Advocates of this plan had gone so far as to begin drafting systems of administration for an occupied Australia. Yet Yamamoto rejected the proposal. He believed it would take too long, require immense resources, and still fail to deliver the kind of stunning blow needed to force America into peace talks. Australia, though strategically important, was not spectacular enough. The Midway gamble instead, Yamamoto insisted on a daring alternative, an operation that would bring the American carriers into open battle and destroy them. His chosen target was Midway Atoll, a small but strategically positioned island north of Hawaii. The plan, designated the MI operation, was to lure U.S. carriers into a trap near Midway and annihilate them with Japan's superior fleet. Simultaneously, Yamamoto drafted a second plan, the AL operation, which envisioned an invasion of the Aleutian Islands off Alaska. If all went well, Japan could eventually occupy Hawaii and perhaps even threaten the U.S. West Coast. The goal was not outright conquest of America, but rather to win decisive victories that would allow Tokyo to extend a generous peace offer, one that Yamamoto believed the United States might accept if sufficiently humbled. Triumph and shock. In February 1942, the fall of Singapore seemed to provide Japan with the prestige it needed. But Yamamoto, looking further ahead, pressed forward with his Midway plans. Then, in April, Japan suffered a psychological blow. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led a squadron of American B-25 bombers in a daring raid over Tokyo. Although the raid caused little physical damage, its impact on Japanese morale was profound. It revealed that America was not defeated, that its forces could still reach Japan's home islands, and that the war was only beginning. For Yamamoto, the Doolittle raid confirmed the urgency of striking at Midway. Japan could not afford to wait. A spectacular victory was needed to restore confidence and set the stage for peace negotiations. Disaster at Midway. The Battle of Midway, fought in June 1942, would prove disastrous. Instead of luring the Americans into a trap, it was Yamamoto's fleet that was ambushed. Four of Japan's most powerful carriers were destroyed, crippling the offensive arm of the Imperial Navy. The defeat was so severe that its full extent was concealed from much of the army. Only the highest levels of the Navy knew the truth. To the outside world, and even to many officers in the field, Midway was presented as a setback rather than a catastrophe. Still, Yamamoto's gamble had failed. The initiative in the Pacific began to shift toward the Allies. While Yamamoto and his staff were still digesting the shock of Midway, the Imperial General Staff in Tokyo had already begun moving forces steadily southward. Their goal was clear: establish a chain of strongholds in the South Pacific to cut off Australia from American support. The first step had already been taken on January 23, 1942, when Japanese forces seized Rabaul on New Britain. The harbor and its surrounding terrain made it an ideal naval and air base, quickly becoming the linchpin of Japanese operations in the region. From Rabaul, Japanese aircraft conducted constant reconnaissance missions and bombing raids across the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, probing for weaknesses in Allied defenses. Alarm in Australia. To the Australians, the danger was obvious. From his headquarters, General Douglas MacArthur, who had escaped from the Philippines in March 1942, communicated urgent warnings to the Australian government. He argued that if the Japanese succeeded in taking New Guinea, the next step, an assault on northern Australia, would be almost inevitable. These fears were not unfounded. In February 1942, Japanese bombers had already struck Darwin, destroying ships and facilities in the harbor. In March, Japanese troops invaded Salamaua and Lae in New Guinea, further intensifying the sense of impending crisis. The Coral Sea. A check on expansion. By May 1942, Japanese forces prepared for a major operation aimed at capturing Port Moresby, a critical Allied stronghold on the southern coast of New Guinea. Had Port Moresby fallen, Japanese aircraft could have dominated the skies over northeastern Australia, making invasion of the continent a very real possibility. The invasion fleet, however, was intercepted in what became the Battle of the Coral Sea. For the first time in naval history, opposing fleets fought without the ships themselves ever sighting one another. Aircraft launched from carriers did the fighting. Although the Japanese succeeded in occupying Tulagi, north of Guadalcanal, their main invasion force was turned back. The Allies lost the carrier Lexington, while the Yorktown was badly damaged, but the Japanese suffered serious carrier losses as well. Strategically, the battle was a victory for the Allies, halting Japan's southward thrust toward Australia. Midway overshadowing other gains. Despite this setback, Japanese ground forces pressed on. They occupied Tulagi, built seaplane bases, and continued to expand their air presence in the Solomons and New Guinea. But their efforts were soon overshadowed by the catastrophic defeat at Midway in June. Ironically, either the fall of Singapore in February or the impending collapse of American resistance at Bataan and Corregidor in the Philippines might have provided Yamamoto the diplomatic opening he had long sought. Yet these opportunities were ignored. The Midway disaster consumed attention at the highest levels of command. Concealed defeat. The Army, remarkably, did not even learn the full truth about Midway. The destruction of 4 fleet carriers was carefully concealed by the Navy, which reported only limited losses. Field commanders were told little, and Japanese propaganda maintained the illusion of continued strength. Meanwhile, the Imperial General Staff pressed ahead with its southern strategy. Plans for the occupation of Port Moresby and eventually New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa remained on the table. The intention was to resume the advance as soon as Yamamoto returned from his victorious Midway operation. After escaping from the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur took command of Allied forces in Australia in March 1942. From the outset, he argued that the Southwest Pacific was the critical theater. If the Japanese succeeded in cutting Australia off, America would lose its springboard for counteroffensive operations. MacArthur drafted an ambitious plan for an advance from Australia through New Guinea and into the Philippines. He insisted this was the most direct path back to Manila, where he had famously promised, "I shall return." His plan, however, faced skepticism in Washington, where the Joint Chiefs were wary of committing too many resources to what seemed a secondary theater compared to the war in Europe. Admiral King's obsession at the same time. Across the Pacific, Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy, had his own vision. King was less interested in defending Australia and more focused on regaining the Central Pacific. He believed that the quickest way to bring the war to Japan was to seize key islands across the Central Ocean, establish forward bases, and drive directly toward the Japanese homeland. King viewed MacArthur's plan as too land-heavy and too slow. He wanted an offensive centered on amphibious assaults and carrier power, rather than the grinding campaigns across mountains and jungles that would characterize MacArthur's later efforts. That a clash of visions, this clash between MacArthur and King, would dominate Allied strategic debates throughout the Pacific War. MacArthur's Southwest Pacific route versus King's Central Pacific drive became two parallel campaigns, both eventually carried out, though often in competition for men, ships, and supplies. WWII mid-1942. However, there was no time for theoretical debates. Japanese advances toward New Guinea and the Solomons forced an immediate decision. Either wait for the Japanese to consolidate their positions or strike quickly to deny them critical footholds. The Guadalcanal alarm American codebreakers soon confirmed that the Japanese were constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal, the largest island in the Solomons. Once completed, this base would allow Japanese bombers to dominate the sea lanes between the United States and Australia. For the Allies, this was unacceptable. Guadalcanal was no longer just another island. It was the key to keeping the supply lifeline to Australia open. The island became the trigger for the first major Allied offensive of the Pacific War, a precarious decision. The decision to launch an invasion was not taken lightly. The U.S. Navy was still reeling from losses at Coral Sea and Midway. Carrier strength was thin, amphibious experience was minimal, and most Marines had never fought in jungle conditions. Even so, Admiral King pressed hard for immediate action. He argued that delay would only make the Japanese position stronger. President Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs reluctantly agreed. The operation would go forward despite enormous risks. Planning Operation Watchtower. The plan, codenamed Operation Watchtower, called for the U.S. Marines to land on Guadalcanal and nearby islands in the Southern Solomons. Their immediate objective was to seize the unfinished Japanese airfield and turn it into a forward Allied base. This would be the first large-scale American offensive of the war, and its outcome was far from certain. Many officers doubted whether the United States was truly ready for such a step. But the danger of doing nothing outweighed the risks. S. Yamamoto regrouped his battered fleet after Midway. The Allies were preparing to challenge Japan's dominance for the first time. The stage was set for one of the most brutal and decisive campaigns of the Pacific. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines stormed ashore at Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and nearby islands in the Southern Solomons. It was the beginning of Operation Watchtower, the first major American amphibious assault of the Pacific War. The landings caught the Japanese by surprise. On Guadalcanal itself, the Marines seized the nearly completed airfield with little resistance. This field would soon be finished and renamed Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at Midway. But if the landings were relatively easy, holding the island would prove to be a nightmare. The Tokyo Express, within days, Japanese forces began pouring reinforcements down the slot, the long channel running through the Solomon Islands. Night after night, destroyers and cruisers, nicknamed the Tokyo Express, raced down from Rabaul to deliver men, supplies, and artillery. The Marines, short of food and ammunition, were forced to rely heavily on naval support. But soon, even a navy would be fighting for its life. The naval struggle Guadalcanal became as much a naval battle as a land campaign. In August 1942, just days after the Marines landed, Japanese cruisers under Admiral Mikawa ambushed an Allied covering force off Savo Island, sinking 4 heavy cruisers in a single night. It was one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. Throughout the next 6 months, control of the waters around Guadalcanal shifted back and forth. Major clashes included Battle of the Eastern Solomons. August 1942, carrier forces clashed. Both sides suffered losses, but the Japanese were prevented from retaking Henderson Field. Battle of Cape Esperance. October 1942, a night surface action in which U.S. forces finally scored a tactical victory. Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. November 1942, a brutal series of engagements that cost both sides dearly, but ended Japan's last serious attempt to retake the island. WWII, the end of these battles. The Japanese Navy had lost irreplaceable ships and crews, while the U.S. fleet, though bloodied, held the sea lanes. Life on Henderson Field and land, the Marines endured constant hardship. Japanese bombers, dubbed Washing Machine Charlie for their nightly raids, kept them awake. Supplies were so short that men sometimes went hungry. Tropical diseases like malaria and dysentery ravaged the ranks. Still, Henderson Field remained the lifeline. Aircraft flying from the airstrip, nicknamed the Cactus Air Force after the island's code name, defended the Marines from Japanese attacks and sank countless enemy ships attempting to run supplies through the slot. Japanese counterattacks. Japanese commanders repeatedly launched major assaults to drive the Americans off Guadalcanal. Some of the most desperate fighting of the Pacific War took place here. The Battle of the Tenor River. August 1942, the first major Japanese counterattack, in which banzai charges were cut down by Marine machine guns. The Battle of Edson's Ridge, September 1942, Colonel Merritt Redmike. Edson's Marines held a critical ridge near Henderson Field against a furious nighttime assault. The Battle for Henderson Field, October 1942, a massive Japanese offensive involving tanks and thousands of infantry, was repulsed with devastating losses. Each time, the Japanese underestimated American defenses, and each time, they paid with staggering casualties. Attrition and exhaustion. By late 1942, Guadalcanal had become a war of attrition. Japan poured in men and ships, but could not sustain the fight. Its supply lines stretched too thin, its navy too battered, and its air force increasingly outmatched by growing American strength. In contrast, the United States was learning, sometimes painfully, how to wage modern amphibious war. Mistakes were frequent, but the experience gained at Guadalcanal would shape every subsequent campaign in the Pacific. The turning point, finally, in February 1943, Japanese High Command made the fateful decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. Under cover of night, destroyers whisked away the surviving troops, ending 6 months of brutal fighting. For the first time, the Japanese had been forced to abandon a major position. Guadalcanal was more than a battlefield victory. It was a psychological shift. The myth of Japanese invincibility was broken. From then on, Japan would be on the defensive, reacting to Allied moves rather than dictating the course of the war. The 6-month struggle for Guadalcanal left both sides exhausted. The United States had lost dozens of ships, thousands of men, and nearly all of its early war carriers had been sunk or badly damaged. The Marines and Army units who fought there were physically broken, racked with malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition. For Japan, however, the cost was far greater. More than 25,000 soldiers and sailors were lost in the campaign, along with irreplaceable destroyers, cruisers, and transport vessels. Just as critical was the loss of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, veterans who could not be replaced quickly enough to keep pace with America's expanding pilot training programs. Guadalcanal had drained Japan's strength. From this point forward, Tokyo's empire would be on the defensive. A blow to Japanese morale. The psychological effects were enormous. Until Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers and sailors had largely believed in their own invincibility. Victories in Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and the East Indies had fed a sense of destiny. But on Guadalcanal, that aura was shattered. The decision to evacuate, made in January 1943 and executed in February, was seen by many officers as an unthinkable humiliation. Japan had not just failed to take an objective, it had abandoned one. Yamamoto's response. For Admiral Yamamoto, Guadalcanal was a bitter blow. His grand vision of drawing America into a decisive battle had already collapsed at Midway. Now his hopes of using the South Pacific to isolate Australia and split the Allies were gone as well. In April 1943, Yamamoto attempted to inspire morale by planning a tour of frontline bases. But U.S. codebreakers intercepted his flight plans, and on April 18, 1943, American P-38 fighters ambushed his transport over Bougainville, killing Japan's most famous admiral. His death symbolized the fading fortunes of the Imperial Navy. Allied learning curve for the Allies. Guadalcanal was more than a victory. It was a training ground. Every element of modern warfare was tested there. Amphibious landings revealed the need for better coordination between Navy and Marine forces. Jungle warfare taught U.S. troops how to fight in terrain as deadly as the enemy itself. Naval night actions forced the U.S. Navy to master radar-guided gunnery and coordinated cruiser-destroyer tactics. Air support highlighted the necessity of controlling forward airfields to dominate surrounding seas. The painful lessons of Guadalcanal forged a more competent, confident American military, ready for the long island-hopping campaigns ahead. Strategic shift after Guadalcanal, Allied strategy began to take clearer shape. In the Southwest Pacific, General MacArthur pushed forward along the coast of New Guinea, steadily moving back toward the Philippines. In the Central Pacific, Admiral King pushed for the seizure of the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas, laying the path for a direct strike toward Japan itself. This two-pronged advance was costly in terms of logistics and coordination, but gave the Allies flexibility and forced Japan to defend a vast perimeter with dwindling resources. The end of the Japanese offensive Guadalcanal marked the end of Japan's expansion. Never again would Tokyo launch a major strategic offensive in the Pacific. From early 1943 onward, the empire was locked in a desperate struggle to hold its far-flung conquests. While American industrial might ensure a steady buildup of men, ships, and planes, the war had turned. The tide, once flowing strongly in Japan's favor, now began to sweep inexorably towards homeland. Guadalcanal was more than just another island campaign. It was the first major Allied offensive against Japan, and its outcome determined the shape of the entire Pacific War. Before it, the Japanese were on the march, seizing territory at astonishing speed. After it, Japan would never again be able to expand. The decision to fight for a remote, barely known island in the Solomon Chain seemed almost reckless in August 1942. But by February 1943, the results were undeniable. The Allies had forced the Japanese empire onto the defensive, shattering its aura of invincibility. Human sacrifice, the cost was staggering. For the Marines, sailors, and soldiers who endured the campaign, Guadalcanal was a place of misery, mud, disease, hunger, and fear. Men fought for weeks on end with little sleep, under constant shell fire, while air raids and naval battles raged around them. For the Japanese, the ordeal was worse. Starvation claimed more lives than bullets. Entire units wasted away in the jungle, cut off from supplies by American air and naval power. Survivors of the evacuation called the island a graveyard. The campaign demonstrated that modern total war demanded not just courage, but logistics, endurance, and the ability to replace losses, a realm in which the United States would increasingly outpace Japan. Strategic lessons. Guadalcanal proved several key truths of the Pacific War. Airfields were the true prize. Control of Henderson Field gave the Allies the ability to dominate surrounding seas and skies. Naval power was decisive. Every shipment of supplies, every reinforcement, every bombardment depended on fleets that clashed in some of the fiercest battles of the war. The war would be long. Neither side could win quickly. Victory would come only through grinding attrition. For the United States, this was sobering, but also encouraging. America's industrial and manpower reserves meant it could bear such costs in a way Japan could not. The symbolic Weight Guadalcanal entered history as a symbol. For the Japanese, it was remembered as a tragedy, a place where valor met hopeless odds. For the Americans and their allies, it became a rallying cry. Proof that the tide could be turned at IT was also a preview of what was to come. The bloody, exhausting battles on the island foreshadowed the long chain of amphibious assaults that would stretch from Tarawa and Saipan to Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Guadalcanal was the first step on a path that led directly to Japan itself. Legacy in hindsight. Historians often call Guadalcanal the Stalingrad of the Pacific, not because of its scale, but because of its significance. Just as Stalingrad halted the German advance in Europe, Guadalcanal stopped Japan in the Pacific. Both battles marked the beginning of a long, grinding counteroffensive that would ultimately end in the destruction of the aggressor's empire. When the war ended in 1945, veterans of Guadalcanal could look back and say they had been part of the turning point. On that obscure island of jungle and coral, the course of world history had shifted.